Welcome back, everyone. Let's talk about the big picture concepts when working with point-to-site VPN on Azure. In this lesson, we'll start off with the fundamentals of what exactly is point-to-site VPN and why we should care about it. Talk about the primary components of a point-to-site VPN solution. There will be some similarities with site-to-site VPN and some differences as well. And we're going to take a quick look at the interactions between point-to-site VPN and different network pairing scenarios. Jumping on into it, let's start with the main fundamentals of how point-to-site VPN works. Easiest definition of point-to-site VPN is that it can be thought of as network to computer, also sometimes referred to as network to client. Compared to site-to-site VPN, we are establishing an encrypted private tunnel to our Azure Virtual Network, not to another router, but to a direct client endpoint, which can include all sorts of devices like Windows computers, Mac computers, Linux computers, and mobile devices that run iOS or Android. These are the client endpoints that we are establishing a direct encrypted VPN tunnel to. Overall, point-to-site VPN as opposed to site-to-site VPN is ideal for scenarios such as telecommuters working from home who do not have their own VPN-capable router available, and it can also sometimes be used in place of a full site-to-site solution if you only have a few clients, whether they are centralized or decentralized, that need to connect. Next, let's talk about the components required for a point-to-site VPN connection on Azure. Starting off with some of the similarities to a site-to-site VPN solution, we have our VPN gateway and gateway subnet. Yes, this is the exact same VPN gateway and gateway subnet as our site-to-site solution, in which we have a VPN gateway that sits inside of a gateway subnet named specifically gateway subnet. However, one key difference or restriction to be aware of is that the basic gateway SKU is limited to the SSTP tunnel type only. And again, we're going to talk more about tunnel types in the next lesson. Moving on now into the new components compared to site, we have the VPN client address pool. This is an address range that is set aside, which will be assigned to our connected clients once they connect over point-to-site VPN. And in our example off to the right, we have an example range of 10.2.2.0/24, which means that if our mobile device or laptop connects to Azure VPN over point-to-site, it will be given a private IP address from that pool. And then our last component, which is going to be the focus of our next lesson, is that of the point-to-site tunnel type and authentication method. Now, from a terminology perspective, tunnel type can also be referred to as protocol. In fact, those terms are sometimes interchangeable. However, what we need to know for the time being is that the configuration of your tunnel type and authentication method must match on both the VPN gateway and the end client. Whether we are working with OpenVPN, certificate-based authentication methods, or others, that configuration must be the same on both ends in order for a point-to-site connection to work. Now, here is where things get interesting. As opposed to site-to-site VPN, which really only has a single authentication method, IPsec with a shared secret, point-to-site actually has multiple combinations available. In fact, we have 3 different available tunnel types and 3 different authentication methods. And to make things even more fun, different tunnel types either work or don't work with different authentication methods, which also work and don't work with different operating systems. Quite a bit to work through, and again, we're going to cover more about that in the next lesson. Just know for now that the specific configuration process depends on your specific authentication method. From a scope perspective, we're not going to get too deep into the individual configuration processes, but we are going to highlight a couple of them when we go through our demonstrations. And again, as I mentioned a moment ago, we are going to expand on the different tunnel types and authentication methods available in more detail in the next lesson. Next, let's move on to talking about the interaction or relationships between point-to-site VPN and network peering. Now, this should be a bit of a review by now, but going back to our previous lessons on network peering, we learned that in a network peering scenario, a host virtual network can share its gateway with a peered network, which also applies to point-to-site VPN connections in which that connection can be shared across one peering hop. And of course, this requires the appropriate host and remote peer configurations we talked about earlier in the peering section, in which our host network needs to allow gateway transit, and our remote network needs to be configured to use the remote gateway, again in those peering configurations. And again, to review our previous peering concepts, this peering connection works only a single hop, in which in our example on the bottom right, VNet 2 can share the VPN connection with VNet 1 because it is only a single hop. However, VNet 3 is not able to use that point-to-site VPN connection because it is an additional hop, and once again, network peering is not transitive. One other last note that we're going to talk in more detail a little later on in this section. However, because we are talking about network peering now, I did also want to note that when you add additional peered networks, or in other words, when we have a point-to-site VPN connection already established, but then we peer a new network to our host network, there is some additional configuration required. Again, this is a little bit of a preview to a deeper topic that will be covered later on in this section, but you may want to keep it in the back of your mind for now. With that, that's going to conclude this initial conceptual overview of working with point-to-site VPN on Azure. Let's go ahead and review our key takeaways before moving on. We started off with the fundamentals of what exactly is a point-to-site connection, which is a network-to-end computer connection, which is ideal for decentralized personnel or telecommuters working from home. We then covered the core point-to-site VPN components, which include our same gateway subnet and VPN gateway as site-to-site VPN. And once again, the basic SKU is more restricted in regards to the tunnel types available, specifically SSTP only. And then we covered the two new components, which include our client address pool, which would be assigned to our end clients. And we also initially introduced ourselves to multiple tunnel types and authentication methods and different combinations that we'll talk more about in the next lesson. And then wrapping things up, we talked about the interaction or relationships between point-to-site VPN and network peering, in which we learned that exactly the same as site-to-site VPN, peered networks can forward point-to-site VPN traffic across a single hop, but not more than one hop because, yet again, network peering is non-transitive. That's going to go ahead and wrap this lesson up. Let's go ahead and move on to the next one.